No one survives crossing Silvano Moretti. He is a ghost in tailored Italian wool, a man who runs Chicago's underground with a gaze as cold as the bottom of Lake Michigan. So, when a terrified, debt-ridden maid realized her 8-month-old baby had escaped his hidden makeshift crib and crawled straight into the Don's private study during a brutal interrogation, she didn't just pray for her job, she prayed for her life. What happened behind those heavy oak doors wasn't a bloodbath. It was a revelation that would shatter the criminal underworld, rewrite the legacy of a monster, and bring heavily armed men to their knees in tears. The Moretti estate was not a home. It was a fortress masquerading as a mansion on the affluent edges of Lake Forest. Surrounded by wrought iron gates, security cameras hidden within ancient oak trees, and men who wore their suit jackets just a little too loose to conceal the steel at their waists, it was a place where silence was the most highly valued currency. For Bella Jenkins, that silence was a suffocating blanket. Bella was 23, with exhausted brown eyes and hands that were perpetually raw from industrial bleach. She wasn't supposed to be a maid in a Mafia stronghold. A year ago, she was a nursing student living in a cramped apartment in the South Side, deeply in love with a man who turned out to be a phantom. David had charmed her, loved her, and left her pregnant before disappearing into the night with $50,000 of the Moretti Syndicate's money. When the loan sharks came knocking, Bella did the only thing a desperate mother could do. She hid in the very heart of the beast. Through a forged reference and a desperate plea to an old family friend who managed the estate's domestic staff, Bella secured a live-in position at the Moretti mansion. Her logic was flawed, but fueled by survival. The last place Silvano Moretti's debt collectors would look for David's abandoned girlfriend was scrubbing the marble floors of his own foyer. But Bella brought a secret into the compound, one that violated the strictest rule of the estate. No children. Silvano Moretti despised the presence of children. The staff whispered that it was because he had no heart, that his blood ran black, and that the innocence of a child was offensive to his criminal sensibilities. Bella's secret was named Leo. Leo was 8 months old, a quiet, observant baby with a mop of dark curls and eyes the color of polished mahogany. Because Bella could not afford childcare, and leaving the estate grounds meant risking exposure to the enforcers hunting her, she smuggled Leo in. He lived his days in the deep recesses of the servants' quarters, hidden in a modified laundry cart, swaddled in blankets beneath layers of fresh towels. The head housekeeper, an aging woman named Beatrice, who had seen too much death in her years, turned a blind eye out of pity. She knew the consequences if Silvana ever found out, but she also knew the absolute desperation of a mother's love. "Keep him quiet, Bella," Beatrice would warn, her voice a harsh whisper in the dim light of the laundry room. "Mr. Moretti, he is not a forgiving man. If he hears a single cry, he won't just fire you. You understand me? He will have questions. And in this house, questions are worse than bullets." Bella understood. Every day was an agonizing tightrope walk. She coordinated Leo's naps with the shifting schedules of the guards. She fed him in the dead of night, singing lullabies silently, by mouthing the words against his soft hair. The sheer exhaustion was rotting her from the inside out, but every time she looked at Leo's gummy smile, the terror felt worth it. Silvano Moretti himself was a phantom to the lower staff. Bella had only seen him 3 times in her 5 months of employment. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, with a sharp jawline and eyes that seemed devoid of human warmth. He moved with a predatory grace, usually flanked by his right-hand man, Dominic, and an entourage of silent, heavily armed enforcers. When Silvana entered a room, the temperature seemed to drop. The maids would avert their eyes, pressing themselves against the walls to become invisible. Bella knew the stories. She knew he had ordered the destruction of a rival warehouse without blinking. She knew he controlled the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in the city. To Bella, Silvana was a force of nature, an earthquake waiting to happen. What she didn't know, what no one outside of Silvana's absolute inner circle knew, was the reason behind his hatred of children. It wasn't because he despised innocence. It was because, exactly 3 years prior, a rival faction had planted a car bomb intended for him. He had been delayed in a meeting. His young wife, Isabella, and their newborn son, Matteo, had not been. The explosion had taken everything from him, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man who filled the void with ruthless expansion and cold, calculated violence. To Silvana, the sound of a baby wasn't a nuisance. It was a ghost tearing at the unhealed wounds of his soul, and Bella, terrified and desperate, was about to introduce a ghost into the lion's den. It was a Tuesday, late in October, when the precarious house of cards Bella had built finally collapsed. The atmosphere in the mansion had been suffocating since dawn. Black SUVs with tinted windows had been rolling up the sweeping driveway since 6 a.m. Beatrice had corralled the maids into the kitchen, her face pale. "There is a sit-down," Beatrice had whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she distributed the day's tasks. "A dispute with the Castellano family. Mr. Moretti is in a foul mood. Stay out of the West Wing. Do not speak unless spoken to. If you see blood on the carpets, do not scream. Just clean it." Bella's heart hammered against her ribs. The West Wing housed Silvana's private office, a massive, oak-panelled room that felt more like a throne room. Unfortunately for Bella, her assignment for the morning was to polish the silver and arrange the catering in the antechamber just outside that very office. She had to bring Leo with her. Beatrice was busy coordinating the kitchen, and the usual hidden corner in the servants' quarters was scheduled for a deep cleaning inspection by the security team. Bella had no choice. She placed a sleeping Leo in a deep wicker basket, cushioning him with soft velvet drapes that needed mending. She carried the basket up the back servants' staircase, her muscles burning, and slid it into a darkened linen closet just 30 feet down the hall from Silvana's office. "Stay asleep, my angel," Bella breathed, pressing a kiss to the baby's warm forehead. She cracked the closet door just an inch to ensure he had air, praying the heavy oak doors of the office would muffle any noise. For the first 2 hours the plan held. Bella moved like a ghost through the antechamber, setting out espresso cups, imported pastries, and bottles of San Pellegrino. Through the heavy, double-reinforced doors of Silvana's office, she could hear the low, rumbling timbre of aggressive male voices. Occasionally, a sudden shout would make her flinch, nearly dropping a silver tray. Inside the office, things were reaching a boiling point. A traitor had been discovered. A capo named Lorenzo, who had been feeding shipment routes to the Castellanos, was currently on his knees on the Persian rug. Silvana sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his posture relaxed, which only made him infinitely more terrifying. Dominic stood by the door, a suppressed pistol resting casually against his thigh. "You gave them the Southside docks, Lorenzo," Silvana said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It was a voice that didn't need to shout to demand absolute obedience. "Silvana, please. They threatened my brother," Lorenzo begged, blood dripping from his split lip onto the priceless rug. Outside, Bella was finishing the silver when a sudden commotion at the front gates drew the guards away from the hallway. A distraction. Bella seized the moment to check on Leo. She hurried down the plush carpeted hallway, pulled open the linen closet door, and felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. The basket was empty. The velvet drapes were pushed aside. A discarded pacifier lay on the floor. "No," Bella choked out, clapping a hand over her mouth. "No, no, no." Panic, pure and blinding, seized her throat. Leo was a quiet baby, but recently he had mastered the art of speed crawling. He could cover distance terrifyingly fast. Bella whipped her head around, looking frantically up and down the long, dimly lit corridor. There were dozens of rooms, antique vases, heavy furniture, a million places for a baby to hide, or worse, get hurt. She began to search frantically, dropping to her hands and knees, looking under credenzas and behind heavy curtains. Please God, she prayed, tears pricking her eyes. Take my life, but keep him safe. Down the hall, the heavy oak door to Silvana's office was cracked open, just an inch. Dominic had opened it briefly to signal an enforcer outside, but the enforcer had run toward the front gate commotion, leaving the door slightly ajar. Leo, fascinated by the sliver of golden light spilling from the dark wood, had made a beeline for it. His small hands and knees padded silently against the thick, imported carpet. To him, this was an adventure. To Bella, who suddenly saw a flash of a white onesie disappearing into the crack of the office door, it was a death sentence. Bella lunged forward, but it was too late. Leo pushed his tiny weight against the heavy wood. The door creaked inward. Inside the office, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Silvana had just stood up, unbuttoning his suit jacket. Lorenzo was sobbing quietly, awaiting a bullet that he knew was inevitable. Dominic raised his weapon, awaiting the nod from his boss. And then, a sound cut through the heavy silence of the Mafia stronghold. It wasn't a gunshot, it wasn't a scream. It was a soft, wet babble. Baba. Dominic froze, his finger tightening on the trigger, his eyes darting toward the floor. Lorenzo stopped sobbing, staring in pure bewilderment. Silvana, who was in the middle of pouring himself a glass of bourbon, halted. The amber liquid missed the glass and splashed onto the desk, crawling across the blood-spattered Persian rug, completely oblivious to the heavily armed men and the scent of violence in the air, was an 8-month-old baby. Leo stopped in the center of the room. He sat back on his diapered bottom, looked up at the towering, terrifying men, and let out a bright, gummy giggle. He reached a chubby hand toward the shiny brass casings of the bullets resting on Silvana's desk. For 5 agonizing seconds, the universe simply stopped. The most feared men in Chicago were utterly paralyzed by 30 pounds of infantile innocence. Then, Bella burst through the doors. She didn't care about the guns. She didn't care about the blood on the floor. She threw herself onto the rug, scooping Leo into her arms and curling her body over his, presenting her back to the men. She was shaking so violently her teeth rattled. "I'm sorry," Bella screamed, her voice tearing from her throat in a ragged, desperate sob. I'm sorry. Please. He's mine. He's my son. Kill me. Punish me. But please, let him go. Please don't hurt my baby." She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the crack of a gunshot. She knew the rules. She had seen men beaten half to death for dropping a wine glass. She had interrupted an execution. She had brought a child into the sanctum of a monster. Dominic instantly leveled his gun at Bella's back. "Boss?" he asked, his voice tight, unsure of how to process the absolute absurdity of the situation. "Should I?" Silvana didn't answer. Bella held her breath, sobbing into Leo's chest. But the bullet never came. Instead, the heavy silence stretched on, becoming something fragile, something almost sacred. Slowly, Bella dared to open her eyes and turn her head. Silvana Moretti was still standing behind his desk. The glass of bourbon had shattered on the floor. But it was his face that made Bella freeze. The cold, impenetrable mask of the Mafia Don had completely shattered. Silvana was staring at the baby in Bella's arms. All the color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His chest was heaving, his breathing shallow and erratic. His dark eyes, normally completely void of emotion, were wide and glistening. He wasn't looking at just any baby. Through the sheer, twisted irony of fate, Leo, with his dark curls, his deep brown eyes, and the specific curvature of his small face, bore a staggering, haunting resemblance to Matteo, the son Silvana had buried in a closed casket 3 years ago. "Boss?" Dominic asked again, lowering his weapon a fraction, alarmed by the physical reaction of the man who never flinched at torture. "Silvana, what do you want me to do with them?" Silvana slowly raised a shaking hand, a gesture for silence. He stepped out from behind the desk. He didn't look at Lorenzo, who was still kneeling in his own blood. He didn't look at Dominic. He walked slowly, mechanically, toward Bella and the baby on the floor. Bella shrank back, terror gripping her spine. "Please," she whispered. Silvana knelt down. The tailored fabric of his suit brushed against the blood-stained rug. He was so close, Bella could smell the expensive cologne and gunpowder on his skin. He didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he reached out a trembling hand toward Leo. Leo, unafraid of the dangerous man, cooed and grabbed Silvana's thick, calloused index finger with his tiny fist. A choked, guttural sound escaped Silvana Moretti's throat. It was a sound that made Dominic physically flinch, a sound of a soul breaking wide open. A single tear, hot and heavy, slipped down the cheek of the most dangerous man in Chicago. "Matteo," Silvana whispered, his voice cracking, completely lost in a hallucination of grief and love. What the Mafia boss did next sent a shockwave through the room that no one, not Bella, not the guards, and certainly not the trembling traitor on the floor, could have ever anticipated. The silence in the office was so absolute that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like gunshots. Bella remained frozen on the floor, her arms still desperately trying to shield Leo, even as the baby remained entirely focused on the tall, weeping man before him. Silvana Moretti, the butcher of the Gold Coast, the man who had single-handedly dismantled 3 rival syndicates without breaking a sweat, was on his knees. His large, scarred hand gently cradled the back of Leo's small head. "Boss!" Dominic's voice broke the silence again, this time laced with raw panic. He had been by Silvana's side for 15 years, through gang wars and federal indictments, and he had never seen the Don shed a single tear. To Dominic, this was terrifying. This was a crack in the armor. Silvana didn't look at his right-hand man. He didn't look at Lorenzo, who was still bleeding on the Persian rug. Slowly, with a tenderness that defied every rumor ever whispered about him, Silvana slid his hands under Leo's arms and lifted the baby from the floor. "No!" Bella gasped, instinctively lunging forward. Before she could reach them, the cold metal of Dominic's gun barrel pressed firmly against her collarbone. "Stay down!" Dominic hissed, his eyes wide. But Silvana ignored them both. He stood up, bringing Leo to his chest. He buried his face in the baby's soft neck, inhaling the scent of baby powder and milk. Leo, completely unbothered by the sudden elevation, grabbed a fistful of Silvana's expensive silk tie and shoved it into his mouth. A ragged, shuddering breath escaped Silvana. When he finally lifted his head, the terrifying void in his eyes had been replaced by a fierce, burning light. He looked at Lorenzo. The traitor was shaking, anticipating the bullet. "Get him out of here!" Silvana ordered, his voice thick with emotion, but laced with unquestionable authority. Dominic blinked. "You want him in the soundproof room, boss? Should I prep the tools?" "No," Silvana said, not taking his eyes off the baby. "Lock him in the basement holding cell. Give him a medic for his lip. We deal with the Castellano problem later." Lorenzo let out a choked sob of disbelief as 2 enforcers practically dragged him out of the room by his armpits. Dominic holstered his weapon, completely bewildered, and closed the heavy oak doors, leaving only himself, Silvana, Bella, and the baby in the room. Silvana finally turned his gaze to Bella. She was still kneeling on the floor, weeping silently, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. "Who are you?" Silvana asked. The cold edge had returned to his voice, but it was tempered by something else, a desperate curiosity. "Bella," she stammered, scrambling to her feet, but keeping her head bowed submissively. "Bella Jenkins. I'm a maid. I work in the lower kitchens." And the boy? His name is Leo. He's mine. I'm so sorry, Mr. Moretti. I know the rules. I know children aren't allowed. But I had nowhere else to go. Silvana walked around the massive mahogany desk, still holding Leo with the natural ease of a father. Why are you here, Bella? A girl like you doesn't belong scrubbing floors in a house surrounded by armed guards. The dam broke. Bella couldn't hold the secret in any longer. With tears streaming down her face, she confessed everything. She told him about her nursing degree, about David Miller, the man who had abandoned her. She told him about the $50,000 David had stolen from a front company operated by the Moretti Syndicate, and how the loan sharks under Arthur Pendleton, one of Silvana's own street bosses, had come looking for her to collect the debt in blood. As Bella spoke, Silvana's expression hardened. The muscles in his jaw ticked. He was looking at the woman who had brought life back into his dead heart, only to realize that his own men had been hunting her like an animal. Arthur Pendleton, Silvana repeated the name, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He reached over with his free hand and picked up the heavy brass telephone on his desk. He dialed a private number. It rang twice. "Pendleton," Silvana said into the receiver. "You have a ledger on a David Miller. Cancel the debt." He paused, listening to the stammering voice on the other end. "I don't care about the money, Arthur. Wipe it clean. And Arthur? Put a $100,000 bounty on Miller's head. Bring him to me alive. He left a mother and a child to face his consequences. I want to have a conversation with him about responsibility." Silvana slammed the phone down. He looked back at Bella, who was staring at him in utter disbelief. With one phone call, the nightmare that had chased her for 8 months was over. "Dominic," Silvana commanded. "Yes, boss." "Go to the servants' quarters. Pack Ms. Jenkins's belongings. All of them." Bella's heart plummeted. He was firing her. After all this, he was throwing them out onto the streets. It was better than a bullet, but without an income, how would she feed Leo? "Mr. Moretti, please," she started. "Pack her things," Silvana interrupted, his eyes locking onto Bella's, "and move them into the East Wing, the master guest suite. Have Beatrice stock the adjoining room with whatever a child needs. Everything brand new." Dominic's jaw practically hit the floor. The East Wing. That was Isabella's wing. No one had set foot in those rooms since the day she and Matteo had died. "Silvana," Dominic warned gently. "Are you sure?" "Do it!" Silvana barked, the absolute authority of the Don returning in a flash. He looked down at Leo, who was now peacefully falling asleep against his chest, the rhythm of Silvana's heartbeat, lulling the child. "They are under my protection now. If anyone in this house looks at them the wrong way, I will personally throw them into Lake Michigan." Within 24 hours, the atmosphere of the Moretti estate had fundamentally shifted. The invisible walls of silence and terror were suddenly permeated by the sounds of a babbling infant. Bella found herself sitting in the center of a sprawling, sunlit suite in the East Wing, surrounded by silk drapes and antique furniture. It felt like a fever dream. The head housekeeper, Beatrice, who had previously treated Bella with a mix of pity and stern authority, now practically bowed when she entered the room, accompanied by a team of maids carrying boxes. Silvana hadn't just ordered a crib. He had mobilized his immense wealth with the precision of a military campaign. He had dispatched a team to Neiman Marcus on Michigan Avenue, buying out their entire high-end infant section. Cashmere blankets, imported Italian strollers, and hand-stitched clothing flooded the suite. He even placed a call to Dr. Harrison Sterling, the chief of pediatrics at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, paying an exorbitant retainer to have the man make a private house call, just to ensure Leo was in perfect health. For the first few days, Bella was terrified. She felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage. But as the week wore on, a bizarre routine developed. Every evening, precisely at 7 p.m., The heavy oak doors of the suite would open, and Silvana would walk in. He would leave his suit jacket and his shoulder holster in the hallway with Dominic. He would roll up the sleeves of his expensive dress shirts, wash his hands, and sit on the edge of the plush rug with Leo. Bella watched from the corner of the room, astonished. The man who ruthlessly controlled the Chicago underworld would spend hours stacking wooden blocks, reading children's books in a low, rumbling voice, and letting Leo pull his hair. Slowly, the ice between Bella and Silvana began to thaw. One evening, after Leo had finally fallen asleep in his crib, Silvana lingered by the window, looking out over the moonlit grounds. Bella stood near the doorway, wringing her hands. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Moretti?" she asked softly, unable to hold the question back any longer. "You don't owe us anything. You saved my life. You cleared my debt. You could have just let us go." Silvana didn't turn around immediately. When he did, the moonlight caught the deep lines of exhaustion and sorrow etched into his face. 3 years ago, Bella, I lost my wife, Isabella, and my son, Matteo, Silvana said, his voice stripped of its usual commanding edge. A car bomb meant for me. When I saw Leo crawl into my office, for a split second, I thought I was dead. I thought I was in hell, and God was torturing me with a vision of the boy I couldn't protect. But then I touched him, and he was real. He stepped closer to Bella. He was a terrifying man, but in that moment, she only saw a broken father. I have spent 3 years turning my heart to stone, Silvana continued, his eyes locking onto hers. I became a monster because the world demanded it, and because it was the only way I could survive the grief. But your son, he cracked the stone. I'm not keeping you here as prisoners, Bella. I am keeping you here because when I hold him, for the first time in 3 years, I can breathe. Bella felt a tear slip down her cheek. She understood grief. She understood the desperate need to cling to a lifeline. You're not a monster, she whispered, stepping slightly closer to him. Silvana gave a bitter, humorless laugh. Don't kid yourself, Bella. I am exactly what they say I am, and that is why you need to stay here, because my world is dangerous, and now that the men in this house know about Leo, he is a target. Silvana's words weren't just a dramatic warning, they were a grim reality. While the Don was finding a sliver of redemption in the East Wing, a storm was brewing in the shadows of the city. Down in the basement holding cell, Lorenzo had been stewing. Silvana had spared his life, a move that the syndicate viewed as a sign of unprecedented weakness. Word had quickly leaked out through Lorenzo's loyalists. The Castellano family, led by a ruthless and ambitious underboss named Carmine the Viper de Lucci, caught wind of the strange events at the Moretti compound. They heard that the untouchable Silvana Moretti had spared a traitor because of a crying baby. They heard that he was softening, playing house with a maid in the late Isabella's quarters. To Carmine, this wasn't a heartwarming tale of redemption. It was blood in the water. Dominic brought the news to Silvana late one night, intercepting him in the hallway outside Bella's suite. Dominic looked grim, clutching a secure, encrypted tablet. "Boss, we have a problem," Dominic said in a hushed tone. "Carmine is making moves on the Rush Street clubs. He's telling the other families that you've lost your edge, that you're going soft over a stray." Silvana's eyes, which had been warm from putting Leo to sleep just moments before, instantly hardened into black ice. The monster wasn't gone. He had just found something worth fighting for. "Let Carmine talk," Silvana said coldly. "Double the perimeter guards. No one enters or leaves this estate without my explicit authorization. If the Castellanos want to test if I've lost my edge, let them come. But if they take one step toward this wing..." Silvana touched the heavy wooden door of Bella's suite. "I won't just kill them, Dominic. I will erase their entire bloodline from the history of this city." November arrived in Chicago with a bitter, bone-chilling wind that whipped off Lake Michigan, turning the city into a frozen fortress. Inside the Moretti estate, however, a fragile, almost surreal warmth had taken root. The sprawling mansion, once a tomb of mahogany and silence, was now filled with the jarring, wonderful sounds of life. A high chair sat incongruously at the end of the 20-foot dining table. Soft cornered bumpers had been meticulously installed on priceless antique tables by heavily armed men who grumbled about the aesthetics, but followed Silvana's orders with absolute, unquestioning loyalty. Bella and Silvana had settled into a quiet, unspoken truce that was slowly blossoming into something deeper. Bella was no longer a maid. She was the most protected woman in the state of Illinois. She spent her days reading in the library, accompanied by a rotating detail of 2 guards who treated her with the reverence usually reserved for royalty. Silvana, in turn, seemed to be aging backward. The grey pallor of grief that had haunted his features for 3 years was fading. He was still the ruthless head of the syndicate. He still ran the docks, still managed the politicians, and still occasionally ordered men to vanish into the deep waters of the Chicago River. But he left the monster at the door of the East Wing. The turning point in their relationship occurred on Thanksgiving. Silvana had ordered the kitchen to prepare a feast, dismissing most of the staff to be with their families, a move that shocked Beatrice. That evening, just Silvana, Bella, Dominic, and Leo sat around the roaring fireplace in the main drawing room. Silvana was holding Leo, feeding him mashed sweet potatoes from a silver spoon. Dominic, nursing a glass of expensive scotch, watched his boss with a mixture of awe and relief. "You know, Bella," Silvana said, his voice a low, resonant hum over the crackle of the fire, wiping a smudge of orange puree from Leo's chin. "I never thought I would sit in this room again without feeling like the walls were crushing me." Bella smiled softly, tracing the rim of her wine glass. "He has a way of fixing things. Even things he doesn't know are broken." Silvana looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in his gaze made Bella's breath hitch. "He isn't the only one," Silvana murmured. It was a confession, quiet and profound. Bella felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She was falling for him. It was terrifying, irrational, and completely undeniable. She was falling in love with a Mafia don, a man whose hands were stained with blood, but who held her son as if he were made of spun glass. But outside the iron gates of the estate, the city was boiling. Carmine the Viper. DeLucci had not been idle. Operating out of the back room of Jean and Giorgetti, a classic Chicago steakhouse that served as neutral ground for the mob, Carmine was spinning a web of deceit. He had convinced 3 of the 5 minor families that Silvana's newfound domesticity was a fatal weakness. The underworld thrived on fear, and Silvana wasn't inspiring fear anymore. He was inspiring whispers. Worse still, Carmine had found the ultimate leverage. Through the grimy network of loan sharks and street hustlers, Carmine's men had tracked down David Miller. Bella's ex-boyfriend was hiding out in a roach-infested motel in Gary, Indiana, having gambled away the $50,000 he stole from the Moretti syndicate. When Carmine's enforcers kicked down his door, David expected a bullet. Instead, he was offered a deal. "Silvana Moretti is playing house with your sloppy seconds and your bastard kid," Carmine had spat, blowing cigar smoke into David's terrified face. "The great butcher of the Gold Coast has a soft spot. You are going to help us get inside that fortress. You're going to claim your boy. And when Moretti hesitates, when he tries to negotiate for the kid, we put a bullet between his eyes." David, a coward to his core, agreed instantly to save his own skin. The breach happened on a Tuesday night during a freak late-autumn thunderstorm. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the estate's grounds into a sea of mud and obscuring the security cameras. Carmine hadn't just brought outside muscle. He had brought someone on the inside, A perimeter guard named Sullivan, who had crippling gambling debts that Silvana was unaware of, had been quietly paid off. At 2 a.m., Sullivan disabled the biometric locks on the northern service gate and deactivated the motion sensors along the garden wall. 3 black, mud-splattered SUVs rolled silently onto the property, their headlights killed. 30 heavily armed men, led by Carmine and accompanied by a trembling David Miller, poured out into the driving rain. They moved with military precision, bypassing the main barracks where Dominic's enforcers slept, and headed straight for the mansion's blind spot, the old servants' entrance that Bella used to use. Inside the East Wing, Bella was jolted awake by a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the thunder. It was a dull, rhythmic thump, followed by a wet, sickening crunch from the floor below. She sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug, and crept to the heavy oak door of her suite. She pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. And then, the unmistakable click of a weapon chambering around. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over her. She ran to the adjoining nursery. Leo was fast asleep in his crib, clutching a stuffed bear. Bella scooped him up, wrapping him tightly in a thick blanket. She knew she couldn't run out into the hallway. Suddenly, the door to the East Wing corridor exploded off its hinges. The booming sound of a breaching charge shook the entire mansion. Alarms began to blare, a shrieking siren that cut through the storm. Bella screamed as the shockwave rattled the windows of her suite. Down the hall, the doors to the master bedroom flew open. Silvana emerged, not in a tailored suit, but in a black t-shirt and tactical trousers, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. In his hands was an M4 carbine, and strapped to his thigh was his signature customized 1911 pistol. The father was gone. The butcher of the Gold Coast had returned. "Bella, lock the nursery door!" Silvana roared over the sound of the alarms, laying down a burst of suppressing fire down the grand staircase as Carmine's men surged upward. Bullets chewed through the antique mahogany banisters and shattered the crystal chandeliers, sending glass raining down like deadly hail. Silvana moved like a machine, his shots precise, lethal, and completely devoid of hesitation. 2 of Carmine's men dropped instantly, their bodies tumbling back down the stairs. Dominic burst from the west corridor, half-dressed, dual-wielding submachine guns, a cigar miraculously still clamped between his teeth. "We're breached, boss! Sullivan sold us out. They're pushing heavy from the kitchen." "Hold the stairs," Silvana ordered, backing up toward Bella's suite. "If a single one of them crosses this threshold, I will skin you alive, Dom." "You got it, boss!" Dominic yelled, laying down a merciless wall of lead. Silvana kicked open the door to Bella's suite and slammed it shut behind him, locking the deadbolts. The room smelled of gunpowder and ozone. Bella was backed into the furthest corner of the nursery, holding a terrified, crying Leo to her chest. "Silvana," she sobbed, her whole body shaking. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his eyes wild but fiercely protective. He dropped the rifle, taking her face in his large, calloused hands. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice cutting through her panic. "Look at me, Bella. I am not going to let them touch you. I swear on my life, I swear on Matteo's grave, they will not touch you or this boy." Before he could say another word, the reinforced glass of the suite's balcony doors shattered inward. Carmine's men hadn't just come up the stairs. They had used tactical ladders to scale the exterior of the East Wing. 3 men in tactical gear spilled into the room, assault rifles raised. Silvana didn't even blink. He spun, drawing his 1911 with terrifying speed. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots, 3 headshots. The men dropped before they could even pull their triggers. Blood pooled on the pristine white carpets Isabella had chosen years ago. Bella screamed, covering Leo's eyes. "Stay down!" Silvana yelled, diving behind an overturned antique dresser as more gunfire ripped through the balcony doors, shredding the silk curtains. "Moretti!" A voice boomed from the darkness of the balcony, amplified by the storm. It was Carmine DeLucci. "It's over, Silvana. Your men are pinned down. The estate is mine. But I'm a reasonable man. I brought a friend who just wants his property back." From behind the cover of the stone balcony, Carmine shoved a man forward into the ruined doorway. Bella gasped. It was David. He was soaked from the rain, shivering violently, his eyes darting around the blood-soaked room in pure terror. He looked pathetic, small and cowardly. "Bella," David stammered, holding his hands up. "Bella, please. Tell him to stand down. Just give me the kid, and they'll let us go." The absolute audacity of the request stunned Bella into silence. This was the man who had abandoned her, who had left her to die at the hands of loan sharks, and now he was demanding the son he had never met to save his own miserable life. Silvana stood up slowly from behind the dresser. He didn't raise his gun. He looked at David Miller with a coldness that could have frozen the sun. "You must be David," Silvana said, his voice dropping to a terrifying dead calm. It was the voice that made hardened killers wet themselves. "I have been looking forward to meeting you." "Hey, back off, Moretti!" Carmine yelled from the shadows, training a laser sight directly onto Silvana's chest. "The deal is simple. Hand over the girl and the bastard, and I let you walk out the front gate. You can retire. Chicago belongs to the Castellanos now." Silvana didn't look at Carmine. He kept his eyes fixed on David. "You want to be a father, David? You want to claim this boy?" Silvana gestured toward Bella, who was clutching Leo, her eyes blazing with newfound hatred for the man who had ruined her life. "Yeah," David swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step into the room. "He's my blood. He belongs to me." "Blood," Silvana murmured, tasting the word. "Blood doesn't make you a father, David. Blood is just what spills when you make a mistake." With lightning speed, Silvana raised his weapon and fired. He didn't shoot Carmine. He shot David Miller squarely in the right kneecap. David shrieked, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, and collapsed onto the ruined carpet, clutching his shattered leg. "That," Silvana said coldly, "is for leaving her to the loan sharks." Carmine roared in anger and stepped into the doorway, raising his weapon. But Silvana was faster, and he was fighting for something infinitely more powerful than territory. Silvana threw himself to the side, firing mid-air. 2 bullets caught Carmine in the chest, punching through his Kevlar vest with armor-piercing rounds. Carmine staggered backward, dropping his rifle, and tumbled over the stone balcony, disappearing into the stormy darkness below. With their leader gone, the remaining men on the balcony hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. Dominic, having cleared the stairs, burst through the suite door, his submachine guns clearing the balcony in a deafening roar of automatic fire. Suddenly, the house fell completely, terrifyingly silent, save for the wail of the alarms and the pounding of the rain. The acrid smell of cordite hung heavy in the air. The master suite of the East Wing was a ruin of shattered glass, splintered wood, and blood. David Miller was writhing on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching his ruined knee. Dominic kicked David's dropped weapon away and kept his gun trained on the whimpering man. The sounds of heavy boots echoed from the hallway as Silvana's remaining enforcers swarmed the floor, securing the perimeter. The coup had failed. The Castellano strike force had been decimated. Silvana slowly lowered his weapon. His chest heaved as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He looked around the destroyed room, his eyes finally landing on the corner where Bella was huddled. She was trembling, her face pale, but she hadn't dropped Leo. The baby, miraculously, had stopped crying. Perhaps the sheer volume of the gunfire had shocked him into silence, or perhaps he sensed the immovable mountain of safety that Silvana represented. Silvana dropped his gun. It clattered against the hardwood floor. He ignored David's pathetic whimpers. He ignored Dominic. He walked across the room, his boots stepping over shattered glass until he reached Bella. He fell to his knees in front of her. "Are you hurt?" Silvana demanded, his hands frantically checking her arms, her face, and then gently touching Leo's back. "Bella, talk to me. Are you hit?" "No," Bella choked out, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, we're okay." "Silvana, we're okay." The formidable Mafia Don, the man who had just single-handedly dismantled a hit squad with ruthless, unblinking efficiency, let out a ragged, breaking sob. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about his reputation. Silvana took off his tactical vest, discarding it on the floor. He then stripped off his thick outer shirt, which was speckled with blood from the balcony fight, leaving him in a clean white undershirt. He took his clean shirt and gently, tenderly, wrapped it around Leo to shield the baby from the cold wind howling through the broken windows. Then, Silvana wrapped his massive arms around both Bella and the baby, pulling them flush against his chest. He buried his face in Bella's hair, rocking them back and forth on the floor of the ruined nursery. "I've got you," Silvana whispered fiercely, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that sent shockwaves through the room. "I've got you. You're safe. You're my family. You're my family now." In the doorway, a crowd of hardened killers had gathered. Dominic stood at the front, his face streaked with sweat and gunpowder residue. Behind him were men who had spent their lives breaking bones, collecting debts, and hiding bodies. Men who viewed emotion as a fatal liability. But as they watched their boss, the untouchable, terrifying Silvana Moretti, kneeling in the glass and blood, weeping openly as he shielded a former maid and a baby that wasn't his, something profound shifted in the room. Dominic felt a hot prickle in his eyes. He reached up with a scarred, trembling hand and wiped away a tear. To his right, a towering enforcer named Big Tony, a man who had once taken a bullet to the chest without flinching, was openly weeping, quietly crossing himself. They weren't crying out of sadness. They were crying out of sheer, overwhelming reverence. They were witnessing the resurrection of a dead man's soul. For 3 years they had served a ghost driven by vengeance. Tonight they were looking at a king who had finally found his crown again. Silvana slowly stood up, helping Bella to her feet. He kept one arm firmly around her waist, supporting her weight. He turned to face his men. The tears were gone from his eyes, replaced by an unbreakable, terrifying resolve. "Dominic," Silvana said, his voice ringing out with absolute authority. "Yes, boss," Dominic replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Clean up this mess. Throw Carmine's body on the front steps of the Castellano estate. Tell them that if they ever look toward the north side again, I will burn their houses to the ground, with them inside." "Done," Dominic nodded. Silvana then looked down at David Miller, who was still bleeding on the rug. "As for him," Silvana said coldly, "patch his leg. Take him to the city limits. Tell him that if he ever sets foot in Chicago again, if he ever breathes the name Bella or Leo, I won't use a gun next time. Am I understood?" David nodded frantically, weeping in pain and terror. Silvana turned his attention to the men in the hallway. "And hear this, all of you," Silvana commanded, his voice echoing down the corridor. "From this night forward, Bella Jenkins is the lady of this house. And this boy," Silvana gently touched Leo's cheek, "this boy is a Moretti. He is my son. You will protect them with your lives, just as you protect me." In perfect, unprompted unison, 30 heavily armed Mafia enforcers bowed their heads in absolute submission. "Yes, boss." Silvana looked down at Bella. The fear was gone from her eyes. In its place was an immense, overwhelming love. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm beating there. She was no longer a maid hiding in the shadows. She was the queen of a newly forged empire, protected by a monster who had become a man, all because of the innocent crawl of a child. 2 weeks later, in a private, heavily guarded ceremony on the shores of Lake Michigan, Bella and Silvana were married. Leo, dressed in a tiny, custom-tailored Italian suit, babbled happily in Dominic's arms as they exchanged vows. The invisible walls of the Moretti estate had finally been torn down, replaced by a fortress built not on terror, but on an unshakable, deeply protective love. The underworld learned quickly that Silvana Moretti had not gone soft. He had simply found something worth destroying the world to protect. The legend of the poor maid's baby who interrupted an execution became the most fiercely guarded myth in Chicago's criminal history. It wasn't a story of weakness, but a testament to the unpredictable, redeeming power of love. Silvana Moretti remained a feared figure, but his cruelty was replaced by a calculated justice. Bella, once a terrified fugitive scrubbing marble floors, transformed the estate into a genuine home, ruling the underworld's domestic sphere with grace and unyielding strength. As for Leo, he grew up surrounded by ruthless men who would gladly die for him, calling a Mafia Don Dad with absolute sincerity. The baby's innocent crawl across a blood-stained Persian rug didn't just save a traitor's life, it resurrected a broken empire, proving that even in a world governed by shadows, darkness cannot survive the brightest, purest light of a child's grace.